Hey everyone, it's Justine from It's Just Paper, and today on CraftStash channel, I'm going to be showing you how to create an ink blended background to make 2-for-1 cards. So you can see I've cut myself down a piece of A4 cardstock in half, and I'm going to be making a larger background than usual. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to be able to get a lot of die cuts out of this. And since I already have my blending tools and my inks out anyway, I might as well create a large panel, and then I might even have some left over for additional cards later. I'm going to grab myself a fall palette of ink colors as well, some yellow, orange, red, and brown. And I'm going to use a domed blending tool here, and I'm going to start blending the background. Now, it doesn't matter what type of blending tool that you're using here, anything that you have or a makeup sponge will do, but I do find that certain blending tools take longer to blend the colors or to get the color really into a bright look. So I like to use these domed ones here when I'm just working straight on cardstock and I want to get a really vibrant look quickly. Now, I don't use these blending tools, for example, when using intricate stencils. So I kind of have a variety of blending tools for different occasions. And for this type here, where you're just blending a background, these ones here are more than enough. So I'm grabbing and going in a circular motion. You'll notice that most of the time I start off of the cardstock and work my way in. And when I start in the center of the cardstock, I will be very, very gently putting it down just so I can avoid harsh lines. Although when it comes to this technique, imperfections are totally fine. Because we're going to be die cutting this background, any imperfections you might have probably aren't going to show up too much. So you can see here I have a very large piece of paper already completed with all of the ink colors. I go back and forth between my colors quite often just to get the blend a little bit smoother. Again, I'm not worried about a perfect blend here at all because we're going to be die cutting this anyway, but I do try to avoid any areas that might have still some white space. The next thing I'm going to do is just grab a spray bottle here, and I'm just going to spray over top just to let that ink kind of react with the water. I think it looks just very pretty, and I am going to wait for this to dry before die cutting this. I find if I die cut wet cardstock, it doesn't usually turn out too well. All right, so this is where the large piece of cardstock comes in handy. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my die cutting machine and I'm going to arrange the leaves on here. I do try to arrange the leaves in a way that they're touching at least one color, more than one color, so that you can really see the blend. And I also want to leave enough cardstock empty on my die cutting machine to cut myself a card background, so an A2 size background for a second card. So just keep that in mind. You want to have enough room there for an A2 size card background and then all of the dies. Once you're finished die cutting, you can set this off to the side, and we're going to be using it later as well. In the meantime, I've also gone out and cut the leaves several times using gold cardstock. And this way I have a great outline and I have the insides all ready to go. And this I would recommend if you don't have gold cardstock, will also look amazing in black. It would look great in white. You're just going to get a different look depending on how you use the accent color. If you do a white on white, then the colors are really going to pop. If you do a gold on white, you get more of an elegant look, I find. And then if you do a black with the colored insides, you're going to really bring out those colors. So what you're going to do next is grab the leaves that you just die cut, and of course those gold pieces there I have actually glued onto my cardstock at this point, and I'm just going to add glue in the center here and place them down. You do want to make sure that they're glued well, especially going out towards the edges of the cardstock because we're going to be doing some trimming after, and you don't want to have any of the pieces falling out. You want them nicely attached to the white cardstock where possible. So you can see here when I'm going along the edge of the cardstock, making sure there's glue there for sure. So we're just taking out each of the inner parts of each leaf and placing them within the gold leaf. Once you are finished placing all of the insides into the gold parts of the leaves, then you're pretty much finished at this point with the background. The only thing that's left to do, of course, is to trim the leaves. So what you're going to do is just flip around the cardstock. And trim any of the leaves that are hanging outside of the rectangle. But don't toss these pieces at all. You can use these little pieces to fill in any sort of white gaps along the edges of your card to make it look more realistic looking and more of a great pattern. But then you're also not having to do really any extra work because you have everything already die cut. So sometimes I have to go and cut extra dies to do this, but when I trim the areas, I don't have to go cut extra dies. I could just use these leftover pieces. So you can see here, I'm just taking one of those leaves there. That wasn't a complete leaf anymore at all. It was a part of one of the other ones that I just cut off, and I can then just add in the insides and just start to slowly fill in the gaps where I feel like there might be a little bit more color needed. When I'm all finished and happy with the background, I've gone ahead and filled in any of the gaps where I feel like there's a lot of white space still with a glue dot, and I'm just going to use some gold confetti here and just place it on top of the glue. This is a really great way to fill in areas that might feel a little incomplete. And don't forget, if there's any areas that don't look quite right to you, that might be a great spot to place your sentiment after. There's no need to start over. Now that is our first card from our 2-for-1 card. Now remember when I said don't throw anything away? Well, you can see here, this is my space where I have cut out all my leaves. You'll see I ended up actually using the whole panel. I didn't end up reserving an entire solid background, but that's okay. So I'm going to pick and choose the area that I think is my favorite and looks nice, and I'm going to trim it down to 4 by 5¼ inches. Or if you prefer a card without a border, you can do 4¼ by 5½ inches. I'm going to place this down onto my card base that I already have pre-cut and pre-scored. This is an A2 size card base. I always personally work on A2 size cards, but you can change this to a 5 by 7 as well if you prefer. And now I'm going to continue with the rest of the gold leaves that I had sitting there, and I'm going to start layering them into the shadows. Now you don't have to do this, but I just think adding the details looks really nice. You can leave them white as it is. You can easily turn a panel like this into a shaker card. There are so many possibilities out there that you could use this background for. And if you don't like the ink blended look, for example, you can also use this as a stencil, for example. Stencil over top and get some leaves for your background. All right, so now I'm finished placing all of these gold pieces, or I'm just finishing up anyway, and you see how beautiful that this turns out. And once again, of course, trimming down the areas that aren't necessary, that are hanging off of the card. Now here's a look at that. Now, what happens if you're not great at ink blending, or maybe you don't have those supplies? One of the things I suggest is grabbing yourself some sprays. Any brand is fine. You could also grab some water and add a couple of drops of an ink refill, for example, if you don't have sprays. And this ends up creating the background a lot more quickly. Now, the nice thing about sprays, there's 2 ways that you can use them. There's actually lots of ways you can use them, but you can apply them to a wet surface or you can apply them to a dry surface. At the moment, I'm applying to a dry surface and then adding some water later to help them mix together. But if I had originally put them on a wet surface, they would blend a lot better than they are right now. But I don't mind having those sort of harsher areas on my cardstock right now because I am die cutting this background. If I was using the background for a card, just as a solid, I probably would have put water down first. But you can see adding some water later and then tilting the cardstock helps everything blend. Sprays are also going to help you as well get a little bit more shine to your leaves. So for example, you can often find gold spray, bronze spray, copper spray, that kind of thing. And I do always recommend just letting it air dry versus drying it with a heat tool. I feel like it gives it just a little bit of a different look, and it allows the colors to really just seep into the cardstock. So you could use these die cuts for the leaves as well. Another thing that I like to do is I like to add some foam tape behind my die cuts when it's going through the machine. Sure, it takes a little bit more effort to crank it through the machine when you have a bit of a thicker surface that you're working on, but it allows me to get a really beautiful 3D effect or a dimensional effect on my card without having to either stack the die cuts, like cut out 5 of these leaves and glue them together to get a really thick die cut, And it also allows me to avoid really, really fussy gluing when it comes to trying to put some sort of foam tape on the back of very thin die cuts like this one. So you can see here I have a piece of foam. I added some adhesive to it, and then I'm able to kind of pick out the insides with a pokey tool here and just remove them. And then I can go ahead and use these as 3D die cuts. It's a little bit of a finicky thing to do, but it's a lot easier than going in and stacking die cuts or attempting to add foam tape to the back of these in tiny little bits and pieces. Now, when it comes to arranging die cuts in a background to make it look natural, I have a few tips for you as well. First of all, you don't want them all facing in the same direction. You want some facing upwards, downwards, to the left, to the right, just to make it a little bit more random. Next up, you do want some of your die cuts to hang off of the cardstock rather than them being all within the border of the cardstock. It gives it a much more natural look. And you can see, because these are glued onto foam, you'll see the shadow that it creates on the card. That dimension is there and very visible, and I think it looks really fantastic. Generally, if you're not covering the entire background, you want to work in odd numbers when adding your die cuts. And of course, you can use the same strategy as we used earlier by cutting and removing the edges of those leaves and then using them to fill in white gaps. So you can see just adding these tiny little pieces here really does go a long way when it comes to putting the card together. So you can see the final result here with all of that dimension. I finished off these cards by using the Thankful Shadow die set, and this comes with lots of great fall themed, but also some standard sentiments like happy birthday and sending my love and just for you. And this way I could cut the shadow behind the sentiment so that it doesn't get lost in the background. Now, I hope you learned a lot from this video, and of course, any die that has the inside and the outer layer you can apply this technique to, so take a look at your stash and see what you have, and check out the Falling Leaves collection. It really is beautiful for creating autumn-themed cards.